You are standing in the suffocating darkness of a subterranean corridor beneath the burning sands of Abydos, where the air tastes of pulverized limestone and 3,000-year-old dust. A heavy hand grips your wrist in the pitch blackness. It belongs to the chief inspector of Egyptian antiquities, and he has dragged you down into these unexcavated ruins without a torch, testing whether you will stumble blindly or scream in the dark. You don't stumble, because your fingers trace the carved stone of the wall with the terrifying familiarity of someone walking through their own childhood bedroom, identifying hidden reliefs of gods and kings that no living eye has seen for millennia. You know precisely where the secret well lies buried beneath the rubble, and you know the exact depth of the ancient garden roots waiting under the desert floor. Not because you have studied a map, but because you remember dying here 3,000 years ago. The journey that led to this subterranean darkness did not begin in the desert, but in the damp Edwardian London in the autumn of 1907. Dorothy Eady was only 3 years old when she slipped on a flight of wooden stairs in her family home, tumbling downward and striking her head with a force that left her motionless on the floorboards. The family physician arrived swiftly, conducted his examination amidst the frantic weeping of her parents, and solemnly declared the child dead from severe cranial trauma, leaving the body on the bed while he departed to arrange the death certificate. When he returned less than an hour later, the grieving household was thrown into a different kind of terror. For the little girl was sitting upright on her mattress, playing quietly with her toys as though she had merely awakened from an afternoon's slumber. Yet, the parents would soon realize that the child who had fallen down those stairs was not the same child who had risen from the bed, because behind her young eyes lay a hollow estrangement that terrified her mother. In the months following her impossible revival, her behavior deteriorated into an inconsolable grief that defied medical explanation or parental comfort. She would hide beneath tables and beds, begging her bewildered mother to take her home, and rejecting the cozy familiarity of her London neighborhood as a foreign and hostile land. Her speech patterns shifted unpredictably, with family letters noting that she began speaking in a formal cadence that sounded entirely alien to her working-class British household, while developing an absolute aversion to Christian churches and religious symbols. Medical practitioners of the era could offer little beyond vague diagnoses of nervous shock and childhood hysteria, suggesting that time and discipline would eventually cure the girl of her peculiar melancholia. That medical optimism shattered entirely around her 4th birthday, when her parents carried her through the galleries of the British Museum in hopes that a day among the curiosities of the world might distract her wandering mind. Entering the Egyptian sculpture galleries, the young child broke away from her parents' grasp and ran frantically through the halls until she collapsed at the base of the statues. Visitors and museum guards watched with unease as the little girl threw her arms around the icy ankles of the stone pharaohs, kissing their carved feet and sobbing with a mixture of agony and profound relief. When her mother attempted to pull her away, the child screamed with unnatural ferocity that these deities were her true family and that she had finally been returned to her people. Moments later, her eyes locked onto a glass-encased photograph of the Temple of Sety I at Abydos, a ruined complex standing hundreds of miles south of Cairo along the bend of the Nile River. She pressed her face against the glass and whispered to her terrified mother that she was looking at her home, though she wept that the gardens and the trees were missing from the sand. From that afternoon forward, her life became an obsessive preparation for a return to a landscape she had only ever seen in photographic plates and feverish waking dreams. As Dorothy matured into a teenager, her obsessions metastasized into nocturnal visitations that blurred the boundaries between dreams, hallucinations, and spectral contact. Driven by a desperate need to understand the voices and images echoing in her mind, she haunted the reading rooms of the British Museum as she grew into adulthood during the 1920s, and absorbed complex Egyptological texts and ancient histories with a speed that startled the senior curators who observed her silent vigilance. She soon captured the attention of Sir E. A. Wallace Budge, the legendary keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities, who agreed to mentor the unusual young woman in the difficult art of reading Middle Egyptian hieroglyphs. Budge was reportedly unnerved by his student, noting in private conversations that she didn't study the phonetic symbols as a scholar learning a dead language, but rather seemed to recognize the complex script instantly, as though she was merely remembering a forgotten native tongue. This was not the academic curiosity of a bright student, but the quiet survival mechanism of an exile preparing to cross an ocean to reclaim a life that had been stolen by centuries of silence. The inevitable migration occurred in 1933, when Dorothy Eady boarded a ship bound for Cairo, leaving her English identity behind and marrying an Egyptian student named Imam Abdel Megwid, whom she had met in London. Upon setting foot on the docks of Alexandria, she fell to her knees and kissed the soil, declaring to those around that her long exile had finally come to an end. She settled into domestic life in Cairo and soon gave birth to a son whom she defiantly named Sety, a choice that led her new friends to address her by the traditional Arabic honorific Omm Sety, meaning the mother of Seti. Yet domestic tranquility in modern Cairo quickly withered under the weight of her obsession when the visions of her youth escalated into nocturnal possessions. Her husband grew terrified as he frequently woke in the dead of night to find his wife in a deep trance, furiously writing ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs in the pitch blackness of their bedroom. Over 12 months of these nocturnal trances, which she described as physical visitations by an astral entity named Hor-Ra, a deeply disturbing narrative bled onto the pages beneath her moving hand. The writings detailed the life of a young girl named Bentrashit, who lived during the reign of Pharaoh Seti I in the 19th dynasty, nearly 1,300 years before the birth of Christ. According to these writings, Bentrashit was the daughter of a humble vegetable seller and a soldier. But when her mother died, the toddler was given over to the Temple of Seti at Abydos to be raised by the priests as a consecrated virgin. Years later, she caught the eye of the living pharaoh himself, Seti I, who had arrived to inspect the construction of his monument. What followed was a forbidden romance woven through the shadowed corridors of the holy complex, an illicit affair that ultimately left the young priestess pregnant with the ruler's child. The narrative culminated in a nightmare of religious scandal and sacrificial despair that Dorothy claimed she could still feel vibrating in her physical chest during waking hours. When the high priest of Abydos discovered the pregnancy, he interrogated the girl with cruel severity, informing her that her crime against the gods would result in her public execution and would cast an indelible stain upon the divine honor of the pharaoh she loved. To protect Sety from political ruin and to escape the agony of public humiliation, the young priestess slipped into the temple apothecary, swallowed a lethal draught of poison, and died alone on the cold stone floor before her lover could return to save her. When Sety finally arrived at the temple and discovered her broken body, he was plunged into a grief so profound that he vowed her spirit would never be forgotten, binding their souls together across the river of death. For the terrified Imam, watching his British wife seamlessly write in a dead language while conversing with a 3,000-year-old pharaoh was too much to bear. Her erratic behavior soon made normal family life impossible, leading to a painful divorce that left her alone in Egypt. Yet she didn't falter in her relentless movement toward the ruins of Abydos. Dorothy found employment as a draftsman and secretary for the Egyptian Department of Antiquities, working alongside some of the most rigorous archaeologists of the century, including Selim Hassan and Ahmed Fakhri. These men were men of science, hard-nosed excavators who despised spiritualist charlatans and mystical folklore. Yet they found themselves entirely dependent on her extraordinary and almost supernatural drafting skills and her encyclopedic knowledge of ancient religious protocol. She spent 2 decades working at the pyramid fields of Giza and the Dahshur complex, earning the grudging but profound respect of the academic establishment, even as rumors circulated that she spent her nights conversing with the ghosts of the Old Kingdom in the shadow of the Sphinx. But Giza was merely a waiting room for her true destination. And in 1956, at the age of 52, she was finally transferred to the remote village of Araba el Madfuna, the modern settlement that sat directly atop the ancient ruins of Abydos. When she arrived at the temple of Sety I, the local villagers and the site guards watched, with a mixture of awe and superstitious dread, as she walked through the ruined gates without looking at a map or asking for directions. She moved through the labyrinthine halls of the monument with the absolute assurance of a resident returning from a short journey, pointing out architectural details that had been ignored by generations of scholars. It was during these early months at Abydos that the chief inspector of the Antiquities Department decided to subject her claims to the terrifying trial in the dark, leading to that moment where her fingers traced the unseen reliefs in the subterranean vault. Accounts from witnesses present during the trial suggest that the inspector had deliberately selected a newly cleared and unmapped corridor, where the darkness was absolute and where stumble-inducing rubble littered the floor. Yet, when asked to describe the images carved into the pitch-black limestone above her head, her voice rang out with chilling precision, identifying the precise posture of the god Osiris and the specific phrasing of the prayers without a single moment of hesitation. The true fracture in the scientific community's skepticism occurred when she began to direct excavators toward physical features of the temple complex that existed only in her memories. She informed the chief archaeologist that when she had lived as Bentrashit, there had been a lush garden filled with trees and irrigation channels directly south of the temple walls, exactly where her 3-year-old self had noted its absence in the British Museum photograph. Archaeologists dismissed the claim initially, pointing out that the area was a barren stretch of packed sand and that no classical records or geophysical surveys indicated any ancient horticultural activity in that specific sector of the desert. Insisting with quiet desperation, she convinced the excavators to sink exploratory trenches into the dry earth, exactly where she pointed her finger, defying the established topographical maps of the site. At a depth of several meters beneath the undisturbed sand, the shovels struck ancient brickwork, unearthing the layout of a vast garden, complete with the calcified root systems of ancient trees and the stone linings of irrigation channels that matched her descriptions to the centimeter. The eerie accuracy of her archaeological intuition didn't end with the discovery of the garden, for she soon turned her attention to the mysterious northern perimeter of the temple complex. She casually informed visiting scholars that they should dig in a specific, yet unremarkable patch of rubble to find a subterranean well and a hidden tunnel that the priests had used for secret purification rituals during the 19th dynasty. Once again, excavators followed her instructions with growing unease. And once again, their spades broke through into a subterranean chamber containing an ancient and immaculately preserved water source, exactly where she had promised it would be. During the restoration of the temple's bas-reliefs, she frequently corrected the professional draftsmen on the reconstruction of damaged hieroglyphs, claiming that she remembered how the carvers had originally shaped the symbols before centuries of erosion had worn them away. When the site directors checked her assertions against newly discovered linguistic variants from the same period, they found that her memories were consistently and impossibly accurate, forcing conservative scholars to rely on her intuition to guide their scientific work. This accumulation of empirical discoveries forces a confrontation with two competing frameworks of understanding, neither of which leaves the observer entirely comfortable. The first perspective argues for the reality of genuine reincarnation, or anomalous information transfer, presenting the strongest possible case through the sheer physical evidence of her archaeological discoveries. How could an English woman born in Edwardian London, who had never visited Egypt before her middle age, predict the precise subterranean architecture of unexcavated ruins that had baffled trained Egyptologists for decades? Supporters of this model point out that she lived in abject poverty, never sought commercial fame, and maintained a logical consistency across 70 years without ever being caught in a deliberate historical deception. Highly respected figures in Egyptian archaeology openly admitted that her contributions to the field were invaluable, with some colleagues quietly confessing that she possessed an understanding of ancient Egyptian psychology that no textbook could ever provide. Yet this paranormal architecture develops a widening fracture line when one examines the specific tone and character of her recorded astral dialogues with the spirit of Pharaoh Seti I. Scholars who have scrutinized her private journals and the transcripts of her nocturnal visitations note that the language her pharaoh used often sounded less like the formal and deeply ceremonial theology of an ancient Egyptian divine ruler, and more like the melodramatic, romantic prose of Victorian Gothic fiction. Why would a 19th dynasty monarch, whose worldview was shaped by the rigid concepts of Mot and divine kingship, speak to his reincarnated priestess using sentimental phrasing? Also, she occasionally described him wearing garments and ornaments that reflected 19th century archaeological misconceptions rather than the historically verified royal linen of his actual era. These inconsistencies suggest that whatever entity was speaking to her in the dark was drawing its vocabulary not from the eternal afterlife of the Field of Reeds, but from the cultural lexicon of a woman who had spent her youth reading English literature. This brings us to the alternative neurological and psychological framework, which constructs its strongest case around the traumatic brain injury she suffered on the wooden staircase in London in 1907. Modern neuroscience recognizes that severe cranial trauma in early childhood can permanently alter the developing brain, sometimes inducing profound personality shifts, dissociative states, and hyperspecific obsessive focal points. According to this psychological model, the fall didn't open a doorway to a past life, but instead shattered her normal childhood integration, creating a deep psychological void that was accidentally filled by the overpowering visual imagery of the Egyptian statues at the British Museum. The phenomenon of cryptomnesia, the subconscious retention of obscure information read or heard during childhood without remembering the source, could explain her extraordinary knowledge, fueled by decades of relentless reading in the greatest libraries of the world. Her mind, traumatized and brilliant, may have unconsciously synthesized thousands of pages of academic excavation reports, linguistic tables, and architectural theories into a highly detailed, alternate persona to survive the alienation of her brain injury. Yet, this medical and psychological explanation fractures just as violently when confronted with the hard stone of the Abydos sand. Cryptomnesia requires that the information must have existed in some accessible format before it was subconsciously absorbed by the subject. A brain cannot remember a text that has never been written or a map that has never been drawn. In the 1930s and 1940s, there were no books, no secret archives, and no speculative essays in either London or Cairo that hypothesized the existence of the subterranean garden or the specific location of the northern purification well at Abydos. The psychological model can explain the Victorian melodrama of her nocturnal romances, but it completely fails to explain the physical reality of the shovel striking ancient brickwork in the exact spot where she said her former self used to walk. As the decades passed in the dusty village of Araba el Madfuna, the line between her modern reality and her ancient memory dissolved entirely into a daily routine of quiet dread. She lived in a mud-brick peasant house without running water or electricity, sharing her meager living space with snakes, scorpions, and the stray cats she fed with her modest government pension. Every morning, long before the first tourist buses arrived from Luxor, she would enter the temple of Seti barefoot, her hair wrapped in a traditional headscarf, walking through the shadowed hypostyle halls to perform ancient rites of purification and offering. The local Egyptian site guards whispered among themselves that they frequently saw strange lights moving through the locked inner sanctuaries at midnight. Some guards reported hearing a woman whispering to an unseen companion in the dark. And more than one watchman resigned his post after swearing he had seen the shadowy silhouette of a tall man standing beside her in the moonlight. You are walking behind her through the Hall of the Ancients now, where the carved names of 76 kings of Egypt march across the wall in eternal procession. And the silence of the monument presses against your eardrums like a physical weight. You watch as this frail English woman drops to her knees before the image of Seti I, her aged hands pressing against the cold limestone where the pharaoh's face is carved in an eternal profile. She is not examining the stone as a scholar, nor is she performing a tourist's pantomime. Her shoulders shake with a devastating weeping that has lasted for 70 years. The grief of a woman who is trapped in the wrong century. As she turns toward you in the dim light of the sanctuary, her eyes catch the reflection of the desert stars outside, and you realize with a freezing certainty that she is not pretending to be someone else. She is simply waiting for this temporary body to fail so she can finally go home. Anticipating her end, Dorothy Eady had meticulously constructed her own underground tomb in the garden of her mud brick home, decorating its walls with ancient offering prayers and a carved figure of the goddess Isis with outspread wings. When she finally succumbed to the infirmities of old age in the spring of 1981, local public health authorities refused to allow her to be buried in the garden tomb she had prepared, citing strict sanitation laws, forcing her friends to lay her to rest in an unmarked grave in the desert sands just outside the western cemetery of the village. Even in death, she remained suspended between two worlds. Rejected by Christian cemeteries due to her open paganism, and separated from the Muslim burial grounds by her strange identity, leaving behind a life that still resists every category modern history has tried to place it in. The garden she unearthed has long since been reburied by the shifting sands of the Sahara to protect its fragile brickwork from the sun. And the subterranean corridors she navigated in the pitch blackness remain locked behind heavy iron grates, silent and undisturbed by the modern world. Yet, as you stand at the edge of the desert, looking out over the silhouette of the temple against the darkening sky, her story refuses to be neatly categorized or explained away by medical science or spiritual folklore. If she was merely the victim of a tragic childhood brain injury, then we are left to confront the terrifying realization that a shattered human mind can spontaneously generate empirical, scientific truths out of madness. But if she was not mad, if her memories of walking beneath the pomegranates with a king of the 19th dynasty were real, then the universe is far more porous and haunting than our modern sciences dare to admit. The aftertaste that lingers in the desert air is the unsettling certainty that the past is not dead and buried beneath the sand. It is waiting in the dark, ready to reach across 3,000 years to claim anyone who stumbles and falls on the stairs.